Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Bob, for two really intriguing, inspiring stories or sets of stories. Um, One of the things since I have the microphone, Eugene, I'll start.
Okay, but I'd just like to say beforehand, in case anybody does want to have their mania back, they're being sold in the cantina during the break.
Public service announcement. Okay. One of the things that I was thinking about listening to both of you talk was how here we are all together talking about psychiatry, psychological profession in general, and how the kind of work that we do, how we could amplify that and spread it. And one of the questions I think both of you were raising and explicitly raising is, why are all these innovations, for example, all the illustrations that you offered, Bob, and the Hearing Voices Network, Olga, why aren't they taking hold? They're fabulous illustrations in these contexts, but it's not widespread. And so I started thinking about, here we are, maybe we should be going into community centers, going into schools, not talking only amongst ourselves as people who are concerned and involved in the psychiatric or psychological professions. But what about the community? What about community education? How do family members, for example, when a family member is diagnosed, family members will go along most often with what the professionals have to say. So the education seems to need to start at a much broader common level than at the professional level. And I'm just curious about how that might help the ideas amplify in a more rapid fashion.
I had a number of thoughts and questions to Bob and Olga. Olga had said, "No one gives up power willingly," and it made me think of a quote from Frederick Douglass: "Power cedes nothing without a demand." But then at the same time, I thought of a quote from Abbie Hoffman, who said that the system will collapse under its own weight. Our job is to give it a few kicks and to stay high until that happens. So I have two thoughts about this. Another thought I had, Bob talked about various islands that of people doing interesting work, doing different things in different places, in isolation from each other. And it made me think, what does it mean to go more public with a project? And then I started getting scared. We've been working in our clinic very quietly, under the radar, for over 20 years, doing what we do. And I was thinking of the example of the psychiatrist John Marks in Liverpool back in the 80s, who was prescribing heroin for patients in his area. He was prescribing all illegal drugs in his area. And he did this successfully for 10 years. They had practically no new HIV infections. The criminality rate went down. They had no suicides or overdose deaths in that time. It was a total success. And what happened is the American journalism program, 60 Minutes, a big news program, got wind of this and said, "We want to go do an interview with John Marks." They called him up. They contacted him. He said, "Well, sure, why not?" He did his interview. They published it. And within 3 months, the Drug Enforcement Administration of the United States got in contact with the English authorities and shut him down, turned it back into a methadone program, and he's now living in Australia. So, another thought. How do we go public without, without it being dangerous?
And back to my first point then, I mean, I think it is about how the culture at large thinks about these issues. I'm thinking of a story, a moment with a group of friends many years ago, a group, we would have dinner parties together all the time. But we had very different points of view, and there was one very traditional psychologist who thought that I had no right to write about or talk about psychology, psychotherapy, because I wasn't trained as a psychologist. And her husband happened to tell this great story about an indigenous person, I cannot remember from which culture, living in a contemporary neighborhood outside of Washington, D.C., with Washington, D.C. neighbors all around. And one of the neighbors, felt that everything this indigenous family did was wrong and bad and distasteful. And so there was a lot of antagonism between the two families. And at one point, the white neighbor yelled, you are an evil person and you will die and I will kill you, or something like that. So the indigenous man, went to the hospital because he was just enough integrated into the community to know that when you're in danger, you go to the emergency room. So he did that. And the emergency doctor said, what's the problem? And he told them, I've been overtaken by an evil spirit, and I need some kind of procedure to exorcise this evil spirit. The emergency room doctor gave him a pill, sugar pill, and said, this will get rid of the evil spirit. And what the pill did was made his urine red. So as he urinated, he saw the evil spirit leaving his body. So, that story is like a moment of somebody in the system with the traditional background having the sensitivity of cultural differences and the appreciation for that to allow, some kind of alternative to take place. Now, when this man told this story at the dinner party, I said, that's a fantastic illustration. I'm going to integrate that into an article I'm writing right now. And his wife, the very traditional psychologist, said, how can you do that? That's anecdotal. You can't use that. And, so all of your stories are just anecdotal, right, as well. So it's that, how can we take those anecdotal stories that are so powerful and let them replace that, the dictum from on high, the professional voice, the experts, leave the experts to tell you what's happening here, because we can't possibly be smart enough to know how to make sense out of human relations ourselves. So, I'm passionate about this and all the stories that you're telling. And Olga, I think with your Hearing Voices Network, it is open and anyone can participate in that. And so that's a first step.
Yes, I could just add a little something to what you said. I think that is absolutely one thing that psychiatry needs, is to hear voices from other disciplines. Anthropologists, when they hear psychiatrists talk about mental illness, they just shake their heads and say, where's culture? Where are other ideas? Ethan Waters, in his book Crazy Like Us, talked about that cultures have their own ways of expressing stress. And they're all different. And we have to have an appreciation for this diversity, this multiphrenia, instead of this schizophrenia. So, before we go by our mania, it is discounted if you show your little card. Perhaps we should open up the dialogue to others.
I really appreciate our speakers today. Thank you so much. Did we ever give them a hand? Anyway, it's wonderful. I also want to I would love to ask a couple of questions and make one comment. One comment I made is I realize as an introductory psychology professor for 20 years or more, I think it's a real culprit in this whole scenario because almost everyone, at least in the United States, takes intro psych. And it could be the very last thing you learn and the very last psychology you ever have. And you learn about mental illness, the DSM, and about what happens, the treatments you require. So that I think that's a really good fulcrum for changing the society, at least in the United States, where we have that opportunity to go to college no matter what your capacities and interests are. And I wanted to ask Olga a question. I had the feeling that one gets off of drugs. I had heard recently that it's almost impossible to get off of drugs, and if you did, it would be very harmful. But I had the feeling from the way you spoke that it was not so difficult, or it should happen. And also Bob said they get the kids off the drugs right away. Do we believe the wrong thing to think that it's so difficult?
Is it on? Yeah. I think it depends. I think because they can be very harmful, and if you've had them for an awfully long time, it can be difficult. But I'd say that getting off the drugs is not the biggest problem. Actually, I'd say that the biggest problem is when you've been institutionalized, you've been come into this mental illness world. You've many times sort of accepted that you're defective and this sort of thing, and your life has been reduced to nothing. I mean, for example, when I was on drugs, I slept 16 hours a day, and depending on the cocktail, I could sit and dribble and goodness knows what else and shuffle around, and my brain didn't work very well at all. Sometimes, somebody would ask me a question, and it would take me, quite a while before I was able to answer, and by that time the conversation is long gone, past. So there are many things in that one, but the actual most difficult thing I find, because I help people and families to get their family members off drugs, is not so much getting off the drugs, but it's to fill in the time. You suddenly have a whole day. You wake up, you come into a world where there is nothing. You're maybe in a home for schizophrenics, and suddenly you're looking at your life. You suddenly can see your life. You can feel your life, and you can feel where you are now. And I also find that the most important thing for me, at least that's not any research, but what I've noticed is where it's most successful is where the family is supporting the person. That is one of the so important. And if you have an active family against you, it's incredibly difficult. So it's more getting your life and getting a new life, and also many of the demons that got you into the place in the first place. You've rarely had an opportunity to work with that. As you wake up, they wake up too. So there are many issues in it. So I tend to say that getting off the drugs is a tiny little step compared to the rest.
Other questions, comments?
Yeah. Well, somebody said, well, you said, I think, this system might collapse by itself. I would ask, so how long should we wait? And 30 years ago, Peter Roger Breggin from the US, that was what inspired me to get off every kind of medication when I was a youngster. Peter Roger Breggin wrote about a worldwide epidemic of brain disabling, meaning that was already proven 30 years ago. Nowadays, psychiatry systematically destroys the brain of the minds of human beings. We knew it for many years, and what happened? This epidemic just grew and grew. It's very, remember, in third world countries, India and etc., Africa, psychiatry and drug industry still are marketed very aggressive. And I mean, the story we heard about alternatives just to be shut down from authorities and state powers. I mean, it's awful, and I think we have to ask why is this happening? What is the mission of the concepts of psychiatry, the diagnostic system, the psychiatric medication? What is the mission? There is a mission. I think it's not there by accident. In my view, it's about a gap between civilization as it develops nowadays, so-called civilization, and the nature of humankind. I always thought that, although I've been locked up in psychiatry many times, and they did everything to me what they could dream about, torture and maltreatment, but I never took their point. I always said to myself, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm just a normal human being. I grew up in a religious family, and I know in our history in Denmark, those people who wrote, the hymns that people sing in the churches, all of them have been very far out of their mind. They couldn't have done it without it. But it used to be in my country, you could have even an important role to play in society, although you sometimes was mad or out of your mind. But nowadays it's very complicated. And if we don't really understand, there is a mission. There's a reason why we see this development. There is a gap between civilization and the human nature. That's why we have to find, cultures living close to nature have inspiration. And I think we have to deal with this. So a real alternative would be to fill out that gap, to change civilization, to be more, to fit in with humans. So that's why it's so difficult, because to change civilization might mean a revolution. It might mean to change the economic system. But I think, of course, and sometimes you might think, well, that's really difficult. How can it happen? But really, to go beyond psychiatry means to change society. Then I think we could have maybe some of you know, there's a tradition in academic psychiatry called evolutionary psychiatry or Darwinian psychiatry. And I think in evolutionary psychiatry there are something to learn of, because if psychiatrists dealing with evolution and Darwinism have ideas also similar to mine, I found out. And also there's the tradition of spiritual psychiatry. Maybe you know the name of Assagioli, who did a lot about how could we integrate, because some of us think the spiritual world is there. I have been demonized, and I know how it is to be possessed by a demon. And I don't really like your story, because what happened with that stuff which changes urine red didn't really get the point, because possession by demons can occur. If you're really possessed by a demon, there are two possibilities. Either you kill yourself, if it's a demon that makes you really bad. There are two possibilities. Either you kill yourself or you ask somebody to pray for you. That's how to get out of it, or go on. And that's why sometimes, people say, well, I don't believe in all this stuff. But in my view, the spiritual dimension is a reality.
I agree with you about that story, but I think the story really speaks to the cross in culture, the mix of culture that this person was living in, trying really hard to be in that, Western culture where medication is what happens, okay, while also holding on to his own beliefs. So I agree with what you're saying, but I think it was a moment in time for that person that sort of, was a clash. Yeah.
one of the ideas I was thinking about while the speakers were talking is maybe it's easier to attack the roots of the tree rather than the tree itself, and it will die. And by that I mean we're living in an age where the ethics, medical ethics, is based on what I think of as the myth of autonomy. And I think it's a myth because I think obviously we're interdependent. We're responsible to each other, or we should be. And I think one of the things we could do is just have people boycott medical research until they change the ethics to be, you know, a communitarian, you know, interdependent-based ethics, rather than this ethics that just serves corporations, because all they have to do is give you, quote-unquote, informed consent, and then you sign your life away and you're a guinea pig. So we could encourage people to boycott medical research until they make the ethical basis interdependent. Maybe that would attack the roots.
Well, I was listening to the speakers, and I think most people here would agree, and many people here can also tell horrific stories about things made with patients. I think we are all different here, but we are quite homogeneous in the sense that we do agree that something is wrong in psychiatry now. In psychiatry, but not only in psychiatry, in clinical psychology and in psychotherapy all over the world. But here is quite easy to agree. I mean, we are not in a psychiatric service. Here we are just criticizing others. The question that many of us have in these days is how can we influence our colleagues? How can we influence real practice? How can tell our politicians that we should change the rules and we have to monitorize the drug industry in a different way. So, I mean, it was really interesting, and I have written down a lot of ideas, but I think there is a lack of, okay, this is what is happening, how can we go a step further and start influencing, or at least having conversations and debates that leads to change.
This is how I get my exercise.
I'm just going to connect with the speaker before and the speaker now, because I work in a public service system in the UK, where I sort of, one of the things that we're working really hard to do is to sustain the people, the practitioners in the services who share the kind of common ethos that we have here, rather than have those people all filter away into either leaving services altogether or going into private services. And one of the things we're doing is finding different ways of connecting and creating community, both within our public service and also connecting between public services. And one of the ideas that came out of a recent collection of people we got together was, and excuse my pronunciation, because I had dinner last night with some Spanish colleagues who told me this is a Spanish word. We called it, or they called it, my colleagues, guerrilla gardening, which is not the hairy gorillas who kind of live around trees. But I understand in Spanish it's pronounced guerrilla gardening, and it's actually a guerrilla. Guerrilla gardening. But the idea of guerrilla gardening, thank you. Oh, how lucky to be sitting next to a Spanish speaker. No, Portuguese. Portuguese, okay. Okay. And the idea is that people go out either in groups or on their own at night, and they plant the seeds in just different sorts of places. And then
suddenly people start walking around going, how did this plant get here? And my goodness, where's this tree growing in this area? It doesn't really belong. And that's kind of just one idea, really, that my colleagues have found as an idea sustaining of them, that they don't have to leave and go away, but actually there are different ways in which we can start making social movement.
Rounding it back up.
Thank you. I really would like to challenge you, because as a psychiatric survivor from Norway, we really, really need the alternatives, because the problem is not only to get off the meds, but to stay off the meds. And there is a lot of hostility against us if we are different. In our society, you can see it very clear in Norway. You can see it, I think, not less in the United States, who is one of the countries that I do follow when it comes to law proposals. But one problem I see is that we do the people that has something else to offer, which I hope that you are those people. I hope, but become afraid of really taking a stand, because you don't want to be sent off to Australia, or everyone in the room hate you, and not only the half. I can understand that. It's not so hard to understand that, to really talk against something, it has a high price. But at the same time, what Olga has been talking about, and also what Robert has been talking about, the price of that system is really, really high for the patients who suffer the consequences. What I really would like to see is that those who has alternatives to offer would also take a stand and talk about the damage done and talk against the damage done. So that can come from one place, not from two. We talk about the damage done a lot, about the consequences, about abuse, about people dying, about torture, and we use those words. But we're not listened to because we don't offer the alternatives. We need those two voices together. And I would guess that the ethics in this room, in general, how you should treat people, would be rather high and rather close to my own, I hope. But still, the silence and the acceptance of people being mistreated, it exists here too, and I would really like you to talk up against that.
Sorry, John.
Many years ago, when I was a very young psychologist in a psychology department, I came out of my office and there was Paddy, the cleaner, and I knew him, I'd talked with him. But as I walked past him, he was sweeping an absolutely clean, perfectly shining floor. And I thought, that's crazy. And I walked along the corridor, went round the corner, and then I just peeped back. And he stopped sweeping. And I thought, why was that? And I thought, it's me and my power, my authority or whatever. He thought, presumably, if he wasn't seen to be cleaning, I'd report him. And it made me think afterwards that you can have power without having any sense of having that power. And this weird notion of not even knowing how to give up having that power. So I've been worrying throughout my sort of academic and personal life about this weird issue of power. It's so sort of multi-dimensional in its influence, and um, you cannot get people to give up power by arguing with them, by giving rational reasons. The marvellous anthropologist Evans Pritchard's trying to argue with some people about giving up their use of what they call the chicken oracle. And he says, they looked at me with smiling, with sort of pity on thinking that I didn't understand their reasoning and so on. My only alternative over many years of worrying about these things is just to try to stay communicating, stay listening, stay reading, stay putting yourself in other circumstances to get other experiences. And just Robert's account of alternatives, it's other people getting the experience of the real living alternatives, which seem to me the most important.
I know there are a lot of people who want to say something. It's very difficult. The time is short. And Olga has been waiting for quite some time to say something.
Well, I can say the last time. I was just thinking about this one when people are talking about we need to have all these alternatives and, you know, nothing's happening and this sort of thing. And one of the things that I think is if we look at the history, if we just look at in time, I mean, for example, when I first entered into psychiatry, we didn't have technology or anything like that. And my voice was absolutely silenced. We were not being represented. I mean, we represented ourselves and we could talk in this subculture, if you like. And it reminded me very much of the civil rights movement. One of the things is that there is a subculture, and then there's the powerful, you know, if you like, the black and the white culture. And once we have access to getting our voices out, that starts to change things. But where things also really change is when the white people, if you like, also start to join in. Because as long as they're not joining in, then you have a subculture that knows all about this, has all this knowledge and all these things, and it just remains there. So many of the things that we of course have talked about for years is now being talked about through the mouths of white people, if you like. And this is very, very important. And I think one of the things that I'm very happy to be part of the Hearing Voices Network is that anybody can be a part of the Hearing Voices Network, because we're working towards change, towards giving voice to all kinds of other things. And it doesn't matter what color you are, but it does matter what you are talking about and what you are supporting and what you are standing for, and also daring to stand. And I think that's a very important one. We need to dare to stand. We need to plant those seeds. We need to talk here, there, and everywhere. And we have internet on our side, and that is a fabulous, fabulous tool.
That is a wonderful comment to end on, although there are so many more, and I know many of you wanted to say something. So I would rather have it be that way than have nothing to say. So I invite you to take a coffee break. Do you have announcements, Otar? Okay. And continue the conversation. And Bob and Olga, thank you so much for really great stuff. Thank you.
Just a few announcements of changing of 2 rooms for the workshops, so listen carefully. Ellen Rabouin